So I know that some people are going to be entering as we get started, but we actually have a lot to talk about tonight, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Um, Good evening again. I am Dr. Phyllis Curtis Tweed, and I am the Vice President of Academic and Student Affairs at Bermuda College. I hope you can all hear me well. If there is a hearing issue, just let me know in the chat box. So I'm at Bermuda College, and Bermuda College is your community college, and as such, we strive to be and are a center of excellence. And we promote excellence in all facets of education across the island. It's really my pleasure to partner with the Department of Education, represented tonight by Kim Manderson, who is the acting reading officer for the department, and I can assure you it's no act. And also with Dr. Margie Gillis, who is the president and CEO of Literacy How. And we have been working together to promote reading success on the island by improving reading literacy. So tonight, welcome to School Talk and Home Talk, supporting literacy growth in young children. The purpose of this event is to look at the relationship between language variation and reading comprehension and the acquisition of reading or language skills among young children. For me, this is really about looking at the relationship between speaking Bermudian English, being exposed to Bermudian English, and how that impacts learning to read for young children. Before we get into our presentation, I have a short poll for you to take. And while that poll is coming up, Diogo, the format tonight, we're going to do the welcome, which I'm doing now. We'll have the introduction of the speaker, the presentation, and then you'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So you'll see before you a poll there, and it says, please indicate by marking yes or no if you think a young child would have difficulty identifying the standard English version of the Bermudian English word or phrase. And they are paralleled. So you see birds, words, I know, I don't even know, bathroom, bathroom. So if you could say yes or no to those. And you can start now. So if you're just joining us, people are filling out the poll that you see in front of us. There are 10 items in the poll. Okay, we're going to wrap up the poll in about 15 seconds, I think. Although I see people are trying to answer it. Diego, let's stop it at the 5-minute mark then. Okay, thank you. I'm going to share the results with you. So let's looking at this quickly. The question was, please indicate by marking yes or no if you think a young child would have difficulty identifying the standard English version of the Bermudian English word or phrase. So the first one was words and words. 63% said yes. I know, I don't even know. 71% said yes. Bathroom for bathroom. Most people thought that would be fairly easy to recognize. Foolish versus foolish. 57% said yes. And remember, foolish is kind of idiomatic because it doesn't exactly mean foolish. It means you're acting crazy, right? My ama and my mama, 63% said yes. D, like I work up to college. 47% said yes, 53% said no. Were you two? 49% said yes, and 51% said no. It should say, where are you, not where you. And ask versus ask, 53% said yes. I don't care, which I'm sure many of us here students say. 69% said yes. And finally, bye for boy, 57% of you said yes. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that this is the kind of language that many of our children hear. I know, and I was telling someone about this, that when I was growing up, I had a cousin named Winston, and I had a cousin named Denson. And my mother, my granny, my aunts would refer to them as Winston and Winston, interchanging that V for that W. And as a young child, I didn't know. I learned later that that's what was going on. So I think we had to consider, when we're talking about the young child, how does what we say, how does that language variation impact their ability to learn how to read, and certainly reading comprehension? So with that little preamble, I'm going to ask Dr. Margie Gillis to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Gillis?
Thank you, Dr. Tweed. I'm very honored to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Washington is a professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine. She's a speech and language pathologist and is a fellow of the American Speech and Language Hearing Association. Dr. Washington directs the Learning Disabilities Research Innovation Hub, funded by the National Institutes of Health, Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute on Child Health and Human Development. She is also director of the Dialect, Poverty, and Academic Success Lab at UCI. And currently, Dr. Washington's research is focused on the intersection of literacy, language variation, and poverty. In particular, her work focuses on understanding the role of cultural dialect in assessment, identification of reading disabilities in school-aged African-American children, and on disentangling the relationship between language production and comprehension on the development of reading and early language skills for children growing up in poverty. So again, I want to thank Dr. Washington for joining us this afternoon in her neck of the woods. And thank you again. Thank you again to everyone participating.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gillis. And now, Dr. Washington, thank you all the way from California. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And I have to say that polling thing you did was really cool. I'm going to do that next time I do a presentation. I like that. I've never seen it done before. But it was a great introduction, and it was informative for me to see some of the variation in Bermudian English. Some of it is actually, you'll see, identical to what we experience with African-American kids here. So I'm going to talk about home talk and school talk and how it affects the development of reading and writing. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and something I've been studying for a while now. I'd like to start with shared definitions. So the first one is, what is language? Most people know that language is typically oral, not always. If you're have a hearing loss, it can be manual, but typically we're talking about oral language. But the thing that it does share, no matter how you use it, is that it is a symbol system. And so when you hear the word car, you typically get a picture of a car in your head, and the word is the symbol for car. It's a dynamic system, which is really, really important about language. It continues to grow and change every year just because people are using it. And so, like, some of us know that every year, people like Merriam-Webster, who make the dictionary, try to decide if some of the words that we've started using in our vocabularies are going to make it into the dictionary every year. That's that dynamic part of language. And also, because it is changing all the time, whatever's going on in society really impacts our language. I think one of the things that has had the most impact on our language in recent years is technology. We've added a lot of words that we just weren't using before, or we're taking old words and using them in new ways. That's the dynamic nature of language. There are some languages that aren't dynamic, but they're only languages that aren't spoken, like Latin, which doesn't change because nobody's using it. Language is also rule governed. Those who have ever taken an English class know that, or have taken any language class, knows that we talk about the rules. The important thing about language being rule governed is every child who uses it has to learn the rules. And the rules are what govern the way that language is used and the community of speakers. This last bullet is really, really important, especially when you're talking about home talk versus school talk. Language becomes acceptable because the community of speakers have agreed that it's acceptable, whether it's in the school or in the home. There are rules for how language is used in just about every context. What is reading? We're going to talk about literacy. And we typically are talking primarily about reading, but I'm going to encourage people not to forget about writing. We often forget about the writing system, but learning to read is coming to know how the writing system works. So when a child comes to school, they have knowledge of language already. What they have to learn in school is how what they know about oral language influences what happens in print. And so they have to be able to take what they know about the spoken system and encode it in the written system, whether it's in reading or in writing. That's a really basic definition of what reading is, but it is reading. One of the things about reading is that if you look at the brain hemispheres and you look at, this is a really rudimentary way of looking at the brain, but if you look at sort of this idea that we have two hemispheres and that each hemisphere encodes something particular like language, computation, spatial reasoning, the thing you don't see here is reading. Kids come into the world wired for language. Language is always there. We know that it's in that hemisphere, that as long as children are talked to and engaged with, unless they have a disability, they will talk. We do not come into the world wired for reading. Reading is a taught skill that builds on our language knowledge. And so the importance of language in the development of reading and writing eventually cannot be overstated. And so today we're going to talk about language varieties. I should have put Bermudian English on here because yours is one of the varieties as well. So when we talk about language varieties, we're talking about variations of a major language. In the case in the United States and in Bermuda is primarily English. And so when we talk about the variations of a language, we typically include the major language. So there's Pidgin English, there's British English, Australian English, Southern English, Bermudian English. Those are varieties of the major language. And although we can sometimes, especially in the United States, get language varieties and race really mixed up together, the reality is that language varieties exist across the globe in any language. And that the more languages you speak, the more dialects or varieties that you're going to find in that language. So multilingual societies are also multi-dialectal societies. They have lots of variation from whatever that major language is. So we're going to talk about language varieties that happen in school. So if I go back to this, you'll see that languages often are based on the region you come from, the community you come from, the culture you come from. And school is a language culture. It is an environment where we know that there's a particular kind of use of English that teachers typically expect in school and that is supported in a school context. And so in school, there's a version of the language in any culture that's typically considered the shared variety. And I heard Phyllis call it standard English. I have been in so many meetings recently where we are debating what to call things. And especially in this last year with all the focus on race and diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're really sensitive right now to the labels that we're using. So, semantics matter. So, but that version that's typically shared, we call standard English. We have called mainstream English, and now people are calling it general English. And I think the place that we are now in our thinking is that everything is a variety. It's not that there's some superordinate language that's at the top and everything else is under it. It is a variety of English that is used in the media, in commerce, like banking and so forth, reading, writing, and in schools. This is this shared, general, mainstream, or standard English that is expected in schools, on the news, and in environments where we're all coming together. The thing that's important about it for school is it's the variety that books are written in. So it's the variety that you're reading, it's the variety that you're writing. Then there's the home variety. So this is the way we use language in our homes, our communities, our churches, between children and their parents, between parents and their friends. And one of the things we know about the home talk, home variety, is that it can be close to the language of school and books, or it can be really far away. That's called linguistic distance. And it turns out that when we start talking about the development of reading and writing, it's not just that you're using a home variety, it's how close or far away that variety is from the language of school, how hard it will make it for you to learn to read and write. And so we're going to talk about that today. So if your home and school language is really significantly different than school, as you might imagine, it makes it harder to learn to read and write. And your ability to bridge between your school language and your home language as a child really influences how well you're going to read. So kids have a job to do when they get to school. If they use a home language that's different from the school language, then when they get to school, there's extra work to do to get from the home language to what is required in books and in writing. And so it's important to consider, because reading is a language skill. So there is no way that your spoken language is not going to influence reading. There's no chance of that. Whatever you're doing linguistically is really going to impact literacy development. So when you have a code that's really different from school, it's work. This has been called the mismatch hypothesis. We've been talking about this forever. So we're talking about it in 2021 like it's something we're just learning. The mismatch hypothesis, the article that first references it was written in 1969. And so this is the first time really that people were starting to write about the fact that a lot of kids are having trouble learning to read. And in our case, African-American kids have a lot of trouble learning to read. And so researchers started looking at the relationship between the oral language system and the written system. And what they hypothesized was that this mismatch between the language that you use at home and the one you use at school increases the cognitive load. This is this idea that it's harder, so that you have more work to do. The child who comes to school using the same language at home that they use at school doesn't have as much work to do. They have to just take what they're already saying and code it into writing. For a child who has a home language that's different, you're going to take what you're saying, transform it into the language of school, and then read. So there's this extra step in the middle. And anybody who works with bilingual kids might recognize this as a process that also happens for them. And so it doesn't matter whether it's a different language or a different dialect. Those kids still have this piece in the middle that they have to do in order to get to text. That's what we mean by cognitive load. It means that you have a little more work to do to hold on to what you're saying and translate it into text. And so we see this process being much harder, but despite all that, the language skills that kids bring from home to school will support reading and writing. It just means that not only do they have a little more work to do, but as parents and teachers, we also have a little more to do. And so, when we talk about the cognitive load, without talking about parents and teachers, we put all the burden on the child. But this is a process where everybody's working together to make sure that we're creating readers by paying attention to what kids are bringing to school and what it means for getting them from oral language to written language, because that's really the issue when we're talking about reading and writing. So the other thing I want to say, and I know there's at least one speech language pathologist on the call, and we know that the presence of these home differences can also make it difficult to identify kids who are having problems. And that has been an issue for us as speech language pathologists since the beginning of the profession, that when we're talking about this mainstream standard or the general English dialect, almost everything we do assumes that that's what a child is doing. So the way we talk about language development, the way we talk about books, assumes that every child is doing that. But the reality is most kids aren't. And so getting from what kids are actually doing to an assessment that assumes that the child is using this general language variety and identifying language impairments has been a problem for us for a long time. And so it just makes things harder that for us, that we have sort of taken this standard and made the assumption that everybody's using it. And therefore, this is how we tell if someone has an impairment. That just hasn't worked. One of the things that I'm working on right now in my lab is the development of an instrument that does not do that, that recognizes that there's a standard. The standard is there, but so is the variety, so that we understand what the typical use of the variety looks like, so we really know if a child has a language problem. But right now, we can't tell the difference and our instruments aren't helpful. So it's unfortunate, but that's where we are and that's where we've been for a long time. So I'm gonna, in my talk about language variety, I study African American English. And so I study African-American children and their use of language. So I'm going to use it as an example as I talk about variety overall. So what is the African-American language variety? It's a systematic, rule-governed variation of English. Remember, that's the definition of a dialect. Systematic, rule-governed variation is the definition of a dialect or a language variety. African-American English is used by most, but not all African-Americans in the United States. There are many people who do not use it, but one of the things that we know from research over time is that among kids growing up in poverty, almost everybody uses it. About 99% of kids use it. Children who are middle income, sometimes many of them also use it, but they can code switch, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later. So when they enter an environment where the dialect isn't used, they automatically make the shift or the switch to whatever the standard is in that environment. The other thing that's important about most language varieties, I suspect this is true of Bermudian English as well, is that most language varieties develop as oral languages that don't have a written counterpart. So they are languages that, or varieties that develop in the community as people are talking to each other, continues to be shared across generations because of it's used orally in the community, but it doesn't really have a written system. Now, usually when I say this, people say, yes, but you see it in writing. Absolutely you do. If you pronounce with, then you will spell it W-I-F. And that's where we see it. We see kids taking what they perceive and putting it in writing. The other place you see it in writing often is in novels. If you look at people who write and use dialect in their writing, like Zora Neale Hurston did, you see dialect in books. You also, Huckleberry Finn, lots of dialect in that book, but it's all in quotation marks. So it's a person talking. So it's really just oral language and writing. It's not really a written system. So that makes it sometimes more difficult when we're talking about reading, that we have a system that doesn't have an oral doesn't have a written counterpart. It's just oral. The other thing that's really, really important we have found is that African-American English and a lot of other language varieties, Appalachian English, Southern English, these are low prestige dialects. And so it makes it harder when you're talking about school because they're not valued as much as some of what we would consider high prestige varieties. So a low prestige variety is a variety when you hear people speak it, you attribute negative characteristics to the speaker, not just to the language. The high prestige one is the one where when you hear people speak it, you automatically think positive things about them. When I do this in person, I usually ask people to give me an example. An example of a high prestige dialect that comes up 100% of the time is British English. So people hear a British accent and they're like high class related to the Queen. And that's a high prestige variety, positive characteristics. But even within a British dialect, there are low prestige varieties like Cockney, where people think something completely different about the speaker. Well, when we're talking about varieties of English, most of them are fairly low prestige, but when I ask high prestige, people say Bostonian English. So the English of the Northeast that's spoken by the Kennedys. They're not talking about the Bostonian English in the hood in Boston, but they're talking about that Bostonian English that is considered higher class. Why does this matter? Because it influences how you treat people and what you think about them. And so when kids come to school with a dialect that is low prestige, one that people don't really value very much, they think it's just bad English, they treat the kids like they're not as smart, that they're not motivated, all kinds of conflating the person with the talk. And that's why we include that low prestige versus high prestige, because it has consequences for speakers socially. So here's an example of African-American English. I just put some examples on a page. One of the ones that I heard in Bermudian English is the last one, that F for TH, and the D for the voice TH, dim, dat, does. Very common. These are phonological features. The deletion of past tense markers, so the ed on the end of a verb is not always there. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. That is a morphological feature, so you remove the past tense morpheme. And subject verb agreement is about sentences where the subject and the verb do not agree. They was doing something instead of they were doing something. These are very common features of African American English and just a small number of them. But I wanted you to give an example of what we were talking about. We saw some of that in the poll, which I loved. So some of these overlap. And one of the ones I wrote down that also characterizes African American English is AX for ask. That is very common in the African American community and in the South. So it's a regional dialect, and we hear it in cultural groups because most African American people migrated from the South to wherever they are now. And so we hear it regionally and culturally. So I've been saying a little bit about how much dialect you use matters. We call it dialect density. And so if you come from an environment where there's a lot of dialect, you're a high user, you're at this high end of the continuum, more than half of what you're doing is impacted by dialect. If you're a low user, we might hear a few features, but not very much. You're actually closer to the standard than you are to being a really high dialect user. This is what we mean by linguistic distance. And linguistic distance is something that's talked about with all dialects across the world. And we see these differences in kids who are really high dialect users compared to low, because the high dialect user is the one who is furthest away from the standard. They're doing more that sounds like a different language variety than they are using more mainstream English. And so dialect density is, it turns out, is really important for reading. So why do we care for reading and writing? Because we read and write the way we talk. And so reading and writing are really language on paper, oral language on paper. We perceive language sounds the way we use them. So remember the with example affects spelling. It'll affect writing, because whatever you're doing in writing, you're also in oral language, you will also do in writing. We see kids as old as 5th to 7th grade who have a lot of dialect in their writing, but it's because they have a lot of it in their oral language as well. And we know that reading is affected. So your perceptions for the rules of spelling, reading, and writing are influenced by the way you use language. And that is natural. It is not something that I'm proposing as a problem. It just is, because they're both language systems. But this is what we see with language and dialect. So this is the sentence comprehension subtest of the test of language development. So at the bottom end, the bottom axis, we see delve language variation. This is a standardized test that's focused on measuring language variation. And the idea of this instrument was that so many kids who use a lot of dialect are identified as language impaired when they're not. So this was designed to avoid that. Unfortunately, it doesn't. It actually does the same thing that everything else does. So we're working on that too. But you see here, there's 0 language variation, and then you go all the way to the other end and there's 100%, which doesn't happen very much. It's a lot of dialect, but 100% means it's no longer English. But we see that the more dialect you use, the lower your syntactic comprehension score is. So your ability to comprehend oral language in general or mainstream English is impacted by how much dialect you use, because you're very different from the standard at that point. We see the same thing for reading. This is across 1st through 5th grade. The more dialect you use, the more likely your scores are to fall below the reference line. So you're having trouble with reading starting from the beginning. And our expectation is that when kids are in school, that they're going to learn the language of the classroom by being there. Most kids will. And we start to see that in 2nd grade, where we're seeing more kids who are clustered above the reference line, but we're still seeing these really high dialect users not doing very well even through 5th grade. We see the same kind of pattern in writing. In writing, it's actually even worse. But it's something that we see over time, starting from early grades, that if you do not learn to use the language of school, that you will be struggling with reading. So kids who haven't learned to use the school code by the end of 3rd grade are usually a grade level or more behind by the time they get to 4th or 5th grade. The good news is 2/3 of kids are going to learn it just by being at school. So most kids are going to learn to use the language of school just by being in school, just like any other environment. The more time you spend there, the more likely you are to learn the rules for how language is used in that system, especially since it is English. And so you're going to pick that up just being there. I spent some time in a preschool at the University of Kansas for a while, visiting them back and forth. And one of the things that I saw happen there is that even when kids are using another language, just by being in that environment, they will learn English. They may not learn it as well as you want them to, so you may have to do extra work, but they'll learn it. I saw a little girl who, when I met her in August, spoke Russian only. When I came back in May, she was an English speaker. And it wasn't direct English instruction. It was by being in the classroom, learning what the teacher was teaching, and having the teacher spend time with her on some of the language-based skills. And so we know that most kids will learn by being in school. 2/3 is a great number, but that means 1/3 haven't learned it. And that's something that we see, that when kids are coming to school using their home language, if they're using a lot of English that's different from the English in school, that some of them are not going to learn the code as easily through exposure, but they can learn it. Unless a child has a language impairment, they should be able to learn the language of school just by being there. But it also means that for some kids who are using a home code that's very different from school, that the teacher will have to pay attention to it. And so what we learned about reading that we think is exciting is that the relationship between home language and reading is actually reciprocal. So the more you read, the better you get at school language. But if you're a really high user of dialect, learning to read is hard. And so it's a reciprocal relationship. The consequences of not teaching kids to read are significant because they also impact their language growth. So in the beginning, when kids come to school, we talk a lot about how language influences reading, but after a while in school, it flips. And it's not that language influences reading as much, it's that reading is now influencing language development. People who look at children's books and look at the language in books have found that many of the structures that you see in children's books, we actually never use in oral language, or we use them very infrequently. And they're learning those structures by reading and by writing. So the more you read, the closer you get to the standard and the stronger your language becomes. But the further away you are from the standard, the harder it is to learn to read. So it's a reciprocal relationship that's very complex. But we do know that reading matters. Language matters, but so does reading. So what do you need to do at home? How can you best support teachers as a parent? Well, it's all the things we've been saying all along. The big one is talking. Talk, 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 and then talk more. The more you talk, the better prepared your kids are for school, and the more likely that reading isn't going to be as hard. You need to talk to them at home, talk to them when you're out in the community. And I'm not asking you to switch to the language of school. You don't need to do that. You just need to talk. If you talk in the language of your community and your child gets really good at talking in that language, when they get to school, teaching them to read is going to be easier because they have good, strong language. And so talking really matters. And it should be a conversation. It shouldn't just be one-sided. It should be you all talking back and forth to each other. So if you have a baby at home, one of the things that my sons used to say about me and laugh about, why are you always talking to things that can't talk back to you? I talk to dogs, I talk to babies, I talk to everybody. And the reason is that even if children aren't talking back to you, they are learning about the environment from listening to you. and they're learning the words. So if you have a baby at home, the kind of talk you do is like color commentary at a football game, just talk. And so if you're in the kitchen and you're cooking and you're going to make, some chicken, you say, oh, I need to find the chicken. I think it's in the refrigerator. Where do you think it is? And the baby just laughs and makes noises. And that's the way the baby communicates with you. So even if your child isn't talking back, the fact that you talk means that when they can talk, they will, and that they will have words and they will be associating words with objects in the home. So when you have a baby, talk to them. When they get older and they can talk back, then it's important to have conversations. So you're going back and forth so that you're not just giving commands, because kids need practice talking. In order to be a good talker, you have to practice, which brings me to schools where they want kids to be quiet. I really wish we would stop that kids need to talk. I love a noisy classroom. And I know it's because I'm not the one who's standing in there teaching, but I do love it when I go in and I hear all this chatter going on in the classroom, because it means that kids are learning how to use language with each other. And that's so important. So using language before kids get to school is the very best thing you can do to prepare them for school and to prepare for reading. It gives them the language experience that they need to support what the teacher's going to be trying to do when they get to school. The other thing is that you can do at home is to read. And I know we hear this all the time about reading books. If you are a good reader, then you should get books you should read with your kids. If you're not a good reader, then you can listen to them together, or you can choose wordless picture books. I don't know how many parents are familiar with them. Like there's this book about this big black Rottweiler named Carl. And the Carl books don't have any words in them. They're just pictures. So you sit together, but he's doing something, usually getting in trouble. So you and your child sit with these books and you build a story around them. That is just as valuable as reading the words together. So reading books together is really important. And the important thing is the interaction around the book. One of the things I hear parents talk about, I remember hearing a parent once, and we were talking about reading the book, and she said, yeah, and when I'm reading, she starts talking, and I'm like, girl, be quiet and listen. No. She doesn't need to be quiet. We want her to talk. The goal is not to finish the book at every sitting. In fact, you probably won't finish it. That's okay. To be continued. We'll finish it next time. But the thing about books is that they not only give you information about how words work on a page, but they're a way to structure conversation so you can talk. The other thing that's really important about books is it builds world knowledge. So you learn a lot of things from books that's the only place you're going to probably learn them. So you build world knowledge by reading and talking about the books that you choose. Vocabulary is one of the areas that we're really concerned about with reading, and world knowledge is critical for the development of vocabulary. Vocabulary is world knowledge plus word knowledge. So those two things together are what give you a good vocabulary. So when you're reading a book, how do you develop world knowledge? Oh my goodness. When I talk to people, if I could see you and I asked you, who knows where the Eiffel Tower is? Well, most people know that it's in Paris. Because you've been there? No, because you read about it. That's world knowledge. Where are the pyramids? We know they're in Egypt. Because we've been there? No, because we read about them. And so that's what we mean by world knowledge, that a lot of the things that your kids are not going to see between now and when they grow up, or maybe never, they will learn from books. They may never go to Australia and see a kangaroo, but they can learn it from a book, or they can go to the zoo, which also builds world knowledge. So that's what books are good for. And I said earlier, a lot of times we skip writing. Give kids opportunities to write, to color, and to draw. Whichever of those skills it is, it's really important for building motor skills, for one thing. It's one of the things that we see a lot, especially for our kids who don't have writing materials at home, is it takes muscles to write. And the pincer grasp that you need to hold a pencil, that you need to write, these fine motor skills that you need to write and color and draw, do not develop unless you do it. So if you're not writing, if you're not coloring, you're not drawing at home, a lot of times your kids will be in school and not have the motor skills to do it. And they can work on it at school, but it's even better if they come to school with it. So making sure that your kids are writing, and they don't need to be able to write anything you can read. Let them write what they write, scribble, do whatever they do, and ask them to read it to you. So motor skill development is important, but it also gives kids the message that writing is important and that it's valued. And, I remember as a parent, because I focus on reading and language, I'm a speech pathologist. So my kids had speech and language therapy from the second they were born. All I was doing was intervention basically, because I was talking to them the way I would talk to kids that I was working with. And then I focused on reading a lot because I knew reading was important. So when my oldest son got to kindergarten, his teacher said, "Wow, he's such a good reader. I'm surprised he can't write." And I thought, oh, writing, I forgot about writing. Well, it's because we never did it. And even me, who talks about this all the time, was so focused on reading that I forgot about writing. And he caught up pretty quickly and, was able to write and color and draw. But it was something that I neglected because we often do that with writing. We think about reading, but not writing. So the best thing you can do for your kids, read to them. Give them opportunity to write and talk from the minute that you find out you're pregnant. Talk to your stomach. When the baby's born, talk to the baby. When the baby can talk back, talk to them. And that's what gets your kids ready for school and gets them ready for reading. You don't have to teach them to read at home. You don't have to change the way the home language that you're using. But if you teach them to be really, really competent in the language that you're using at home, they will learn to read and they will learn the language of school. So focusing on strong oral language skills and reading skills, if we succeed at these two things, dialect takes care of itself, actually. Kids who are able to do these things and do them well actually do learn to code switch. For teachers, what does this mean for you? First, every single child, no matter what they're bringing to school, needs to focus on those 5 domains of reading. This is the science of reading. They need phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension in order to read. It needs to be structured. It needs to be focused on breaking the code, decoding, and then also making sure that you always attach meaning to what you're doing. So the semantics of language, to make sure kids are ready to read. Every child needs that. I heard somebody say at a talk recently that the science of reading was racist. And my response to that is no. Teaching reading without science is racist. Every child deserves the science of reading and they need the science, okay? And so that's the first thing. But the other thing that's really important for teachers is to expand your knowledge of what language variation looks like, especially if you don't come from the community, so that you know which things a child is doing are really just characterized the way that language is used at home, so that we're not penalizing kids. Otherwise, you treat them like errors or you treat them like they're wrong. No, it's variation. And the importance of that is your child has come to school already knowing something. So kids are not blank slates. They come to school knowing something already, and they already know something about language. They already know something about words. And what you're doing in school is expanding on what they know to include school language. They already have home language. Now we're going to build school language on top of that. We're not eliminating the home language. We're not going to shame them for it. We are going to expand it by adding school language. And so using classroom materials that are effective and recognizing that there are going to be variation in the way sounds are produced and words are used. And so you have to take those variations into consideration when you're teaching reading. What does that mean? Well, you know that if you are teaching with, and the child already knows it as with, that they're going to start there and you're going to teach them in writing. That's not how we do it. In oral language, we might say WIF, but in writing, it's WITH. It's going to take more time. That's something I cannot stress enough. More time on task So when you get to, that's why it's important for you to know what language variation looks like. When you get to a sound or a word that kids are using differently than the way they're used in school, they're going to need more time and more practice to make the transition from home language to school language. And so giving them that practice, giving them more time. It's one of the biggest mistakes I see in schools is we have a scope and we have a sequence, and no matter what's happening, we stick to it, even if kids need more time trying to learn what's in there. You still teach everything, but there are some spaces where kids are going to need more time. It's not everywhere. It's the place where the mismatch occurs, where there's a where home language and school language diverge. Those are the places where kids need more time and practice. The other thing is responding constructively to the use of home language is really important. Not shaming kids in front of the class, not negative comments. You know, I saw this example the other day that I just used in something that I wrote, that of a child who was reading a book and kept and got to the name of a street and said Orange Skreet, S-K-R-E-E-T, which is a variation. It's a regional variation that you hear in the Southern United States, and it's a cultural variation that you hear in the African-American community. And so when he said Skreet, the teacher got annoyed and made him say it again in front of the class. She corrected him. She said, now read it again. And he read it again, and he said Skreet again, and she made him do it again. And so when he got to, when he finally got away from her grip and needed to keep reading, he read in a lower voice, he read more haltingly, and he read without the confidence that he read with in the initial reading, because now he was concerned about doing it wrong. And that is not what we want to do. We do not want kids to feel like they are not competent language users or competent readers. And so my view for a teacher is, if he's saying Skreet, so are about 10 other people sitting in front of you. And so instead of calling him out as an individual and shaming him and making him feel bad about himself in front of his peers, write down SKR and STR. And when you start working on phonology with reading, that's one of the sound sequences that you need to spend more time on to make sure everybody can do it and everybody can hear the difference. And in that way, it's a positive way of getting to what you need to do anyway, without making kids feel bad about who they are and how they use language. And I'm talking about younger kids, but I'm a university professor, and it's something that I see it still at the university level. The way that we manage this when kids are young sticks with them for the rest of their lives. And it makes them, however you make them feel about their home language at those young years, follows them. I was in an education class in the fall. I was presenting to them virtually. And I was talking about dialect. I gave a full list of features. I talked about how it develops, the history, all of that. And when I finished, a young woman in the class started talking. And she said, I have a question. I said, okay. So she started talking, and she was talking so slowly and seemed to be like really searching for words. And she looked at me and said, can you see how hard it is for me to do this? I'm trying to make the switch to the way I'm supposed to talk, and it's hard for me. She was 22. And I said, yes, I can see it. I can see the struggle all over your face, and I can hear it in your voice. I said, you actually don't have to switch, just talk. So she started talking. And one of the things that she said to me that really broke my heart, and other students supported it, was, I didn't know that the way I talked was a real thing. I thought it was just wrong. And I thought it just wasn't good English. So she made it all the way to college, believing that the language that she used was wrong and ungrammatical, because that's what she was taught, which was what I asked her, where'd you get that from? She said, my teachers. And so teachers can make so much difference in helping kids make this transition without walking away feeling like whatever language is being used at home is not good. Because guess what? The language at home is rich. It makes the kids a part of the community. It's part of your identity and group membership and all of those things. And you should use it. Just like if you're a Spanish speaker, you learn English, but you continue to speak Spanish. That's perfectly okay. And we want that to happen. Well, I want to see the same thing happen with home language. Your home language is valuable. Your kids should use it at home. And then in the other contexts they go into, they need to learn the language of that context. In this case, we're talking about school. The same thing's going to happen when you get a job. The same thing's going to happen when you go to college. Each one of those places is a new language environment and a new place for you to learn how to make these distinctions. But home talk and school talk don't have to be in opposition to each other. It's just that once kids get to school, they need to learn the language of books and writing, and that is different than the home language. If they're going to succeed at literacy, they have to learn this new system on top of the one that they already know. And that's it for me. That's my story. And I'm sticking to it.
Dr. Washington, thank you so much. You have given us really a lot to chew on here and to think about. I have a couple of questions, and I'm sure members of the audience have questions as well. So you can signal to us that you do have a question, type it in the chat box, if you will, and we'll come to you in a minute to find out what those questions are. But I noticed that you said early on in the talk that children who don't have as much of a linguistic distance between the school talk and home talk, usually differentiated by class, have less trouble with code switching. So can you say something more about that? Is code switching actually facilitated? It seems to be differentiated by class, but is it also facilitated by age or level of maturity?
Well, some of it's about age. I don't know if it's about level of maturity, but there is a class distinction where kids who are growing up in poverty, because they are more isolated and are not getting all that world knowledge, tend to use more dialect. And when we find kids who are using a lot, who are really far away from the standard, they are typically kids growing up in poverty. And so why is it harder for them to learn the language of school? Because they have further to go. They have a lot more to learn and they have further to go, and we don't give them enough time to figure it out and to learn it. And so that's what we see in kids who are higher dialect users, is that we will see that their use of the school standard increases every single year, but it doesn't increase enough for them because they have so much further to go. So if you are someone who's about 25% of your productions are dialect, and we found that in our studies that dialect use decreases for every year that when you're in school by about 5 percentage points, right? So if you're at 25%, by the time you get to 4th grade, you're really down to about 5% and are primarily using the language of school. But if you start at 75%, then at 5% per year, you are only down to about 50%, which means you're still a really heavy dialect user. And so some of that is about accelerating the use of the language at school. And a lot of that is about practice and opportunity and more reading, more talking, more opportunity to make the switch. And we just find that as kids are getting older, your thing about age, as kids are getting older and they probably need more and more practice with school language in order to get it, we're now asking them to be quiet. And in our schools well, I just came from Atlanta, what we were teaching them is that you are quiet in the classroom, you're quiet in the hallway, and now we have silent lunch. I'm like, so when do you actually get the practice that you need in order to make the switch? So the opportunity to talk has to happen both at school and at home. It's hard to replicate school at home because school's its own context. And
Yeah.
so school needs to give kids that opportunity. So the fact that it's about age is more about increasing grade. So the longer you're in school, the more opportunity there is for you to learn the language of school, as long as you're given the opportunity to learn it.
Mhm. I see that we have a question from the audience that kind of is related to this issue, in a sense. The question is from Leslie Wharton Maduro, and she says, my son has a wonderful vocabulary but doesn't enjoy reading. I've discovered that he likes graphic novels, and I'm purchasing more of those. How else can I get his reading and writing to match his speech?
Yeah, instruction. So that's really interesting. And bravo, Leslie Wharton Maduro, for buying your son what he likes. A lot of times we think it's about the reading list and we think it's about, chapter books, but it's about what kids are willing to read. My librarian taught me that. So some of the things I know because I do research. Some of them I learned as a parent. So I had two sons. I have two sons, and they were not interested in those chapter books. What they wanted to read was Sports Illustrated for kids. And so I'm like, hey, an article's a chapter. And so I just got them a subscription to that, and they enjoyed reading what they wanted to read. And they became good readers. But the reality is that if you have a child who has a really good vocabulary, experiences, you're talking to him, but he doesn't like reading. A lot of times when kids don't like reading, it's because they're struggling with it. And so I would recommend sure that maybe getting him tested and finding out where his reading level is, because it may be that reading is hard, in which case he might need more support. But the first step, I think, is if he likes graphic novels, then absolutely buy them. But if there's a gap between his oral language and his reading, then I recommend perhaps having his reading tested.
That's
And
an interesting issue, and thank you for that, Dr. Washington. We have a lot of children in Bermuda who tend to be very verbal, and so it's not often surprising that the reading is a little bit behind that, because they do have good vocabularies and can express themselves. There is a question in the chat box also about speaking a second language, and I've lost the question, but it was basically, should they stop encouraging bilingual speech at home in order to facilitate reading? Everybody has said no, but I would like for you to address that.
no. I'm going to say no even more times than they did. So first, the fact that your kids are, the kids in Bermuda have rich vocabularies means that this home language is rich and it's good for their language development. And that's fantastic. But the idea of bilingualism, I had a meeting just before this one where we were talking about how the American Speech and Hearing Association, if you go back about 25 years, they had a list of risk factors for language impairments, and one of them was bilingualism. Now, they're mortified now that they ever put that on a list because we know better. But that's really, it's a way we used to think about learning a second language. But one of the things we've learned is that kids who speak another language have some advanced like executive function skills, like the ability to transition between one thing and another, that it gives you these really valuable skills that monolingual speakers don't have. And so speaking another language is actually an advantage. And sometimes when kids are speaking when they're really young and they are learning a second language, the parents freak out because kids are, when they're learning a second language for a while, they may stop talking, or they may not talk as much in one language versus the other. But eventually, if you hang in there with them and you don't stop it, they will figure it out. It takes longer to figure out two languages than it does one. But once you do figure it out, they are off to the races. They talk a lot, they know a lot, they have a vocabulary in two languages. And so being bilingual is an advantage. And because we are a monolingual society, at least in the United States, we're sort of focused on English. we think that speaking another language is detrimental. It is not. Just like having a home language that's different from a school language is not a deficit. It's something that makes it harder for you to learn some things, but that doesn't mean it's something you should give up. The number of adults that I see whose parents had them give up their Spanish or Chinese or whatever, and are now like 30, taking Spanish, even though they grew up in a Spanish speaking household, to make sure their kids can speak Spanish. So bilingualism is an advantage, and we know it is now. They're now seeing it in, someone was talking to me about this morning, in Alzheimer's. If someone who has Alzheimer's is a dual language speaker, they're finding that the manifestation of the Alzheimer's symptoms is delayed 4 or 5 years. They can't even do that with medicine. They can't delay them, but speaking a second language does, because it activates a different part of the brain. It's fascinating. It has so many benefits, some that we don't even know yet. So keep them speaking languages.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I do speak a couple of languages, so you've given me hope.
I wish I spoke something else.
A question about dyslexic students. Where do they figure in terms of speaking a dialect at home and reading comprehension?
I wish I knew a good answer to that question. That the grant from NIH that Margie referenced when she was introducing me is focused on identifying dyslexia and other reading disabilities in kids who are growing up in poverty and who speak another dialect. Because one of the things that we have learned is that our instruments aren't very sensitive, and they can't tell the difference between poverty and disability. That's the first thing. Wow. So if you have a child who's growing up in poverty and doesn't have very rich language, on a test of language, they look like they have a learning disability instead of, or a language disability, instead of just having impoverished language. And so we're not very good at it yet about telling who those kids are, which kids are really dyslexic and which ones are sort of just struggling with reading. Because in the United States, I don't know what it looks like in Bermuda, but in the US, more than 8 out of 10 African-American kids are struggling with reading. That's 80% of the population. It's like 83%. And so the question we're asking now is, in a population of students where 8 out of 10 are struggling with reading, who actually has dyslexia and who has a reading disability? That's a question we're actually trying to answer right now. So I wish I had a good answer that I was comfortable with for that, but that's the best answer we have at this point. And there are some kids who are African-American who are identified as dyslexic, but they tend to be kids in higher income categories. That our low income kids are very unlikely to be identified.
Well, as you do that research, we would definitely be interested in knowing what you find out.
I would be happy to come back and talk to you all about it. We're actually going to we have all this data that we collected probably 6 or 7 years ago. And in August, we are going to publish that study about who actually has a disability and how we figured it out.
I'm going to turn to my colleagues, Kim Manderson and Margie Gillis. Did either of you have questions that you wanted to ask at this point? Margie?
Yeah, one of the things that that you spoke about right from the start, Julie, and I've heard you talk about this, is the linguistic distance. And that the greater the distance between the home and the school language, the harder it will be for children to acquire those reading and writing skills. And yet we also talked, and you also talked about, how important it is to keep that home language alive and to be part of a community and speaking the dialect or the variety, as you also referred to it. So how do we reconcile those two things?
You know, I'm glad you asked that, because one of the things I didn't say that I usually say is that speaking a dialect does not cause reading problems. And so when you think about the continuum, one of the things that's important about it is that the kids at the low end of the continuum aren't having trouble, not because of their dialect. The kids in the middle aren't having trouble because of their dialect. It's the ones at the top. It's the kids who have so much further to go, so much more work to do in order to get to the text on the page. And those are the kids who, how we reconcile it is that when you encounter kids who are having that kind of difficulty, it means you can't whiz through the curriculum and do everything the same way at the same pace and the same speed that you're doing it with kids who aren't going to have that added variable that influences their reading, and that we have to spend more time teaching the kid how to get from the oral system to the written system. And so I do think that that is something that we found when I moved to Georgia. That is probably one of the most important things we found is everybody speaks a dialect, which was what we were saying to ourselves. Everybody speaks a dialect. It can't be dialect alone that's influencing reading. And we know it's not the only thing, but it can't be dialect. But what we learned was it's the degree of dialect, the distance from the standard, that is difficult for kids. It's not that you use, we all speak a dialect, and yet we can read, and we learn to read well. But the reality is, for those kids who are using a lot of dialect, you know, we're really moving toward, Margie, about not about thinking about those kids more like we do bilingual kids, where we know that they need more language support to get to the reading process, because we have not allowed in the past that within language variation, dialects could have the same impact on learning to read as speaking a different language. But now we know they do, because the kid who's really far away is using language so differently from what's happening in school, which is the same thing that's happening with Spanish and English, that they need more support. So we are starting to talk more about bilingual models being applied to bi-dialectal kids, and are starting to write about it more and to do research that looks at how these kids who are bi-dialectal really are struggling with many of the same issues. You know, there was a big debate in the 70s about whether, like, African-American English was a language or a dialect. And I actually, I want to write a paper that says it depends on who you're talking about. So for the kid who's at that low end of the continuum, it's functioning like a dialect. For the kid who's at the high end, it's functioning more like a different language. And so they need help getting to the language that is on the page. And so I think some acknowledgement that it's not some like monolithic thing that's the same for every kid is important. It's an important outcome for us, and it should impact the way we teach reading.
Well, and thank you for saying that, because you know, I'm so adamant that teachers get the type of support that they need to do this work, and to teach them about the structures of language, right? That's at the heart of the science of reading, is right. Teachers need to know the phonological difference between with and with, and the, you know, syntactic differences in, you know, sentence structure, that distinguish the dialect from, you know, the standard or mainstream or general English, right? And if the teacher understands it, they can explain it to the child and explicitly teach it, versus if they don't have that understanding, then they can't.
That's right. And one of the things I like about what you said, and that I like about the science of reading, is that we're building these varieties in from the beginning. Instead of building a system and then saying, oh my God, it doesn't work with these kids, and trying to retrofit it. Like, no, we don't have to do it that way. We're doing a lot of building the architecture of the science of reading now. Let's build the variation in on the front end, and then we can teach all to read.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's really important not to devalue what we're referring to as the dialect.
Yep.
And, I'm sure we've all heard, Bermudian English, at times referred to as bad English versus good English, that kind of thing. And I think it's really important to make sure that we are valuing all of that because of the richness, Dr. Washington, that you associate it with what we're calling a dialect, even though sometimes the word dialect itself kind of has an implication of a digression from the mainstream.
That's why I keep going back and forth between language variety and dialect. I'm trying so hard like to shift my semantics, but I'm like in the middle of it. And so I keep like going back and forth, but I agree. And, you know, when you tell a child that their home language is not okay, you're telling them my mom's not okay, my grandma's not okay, my family's not okay. This is a part of membership in the community that is raising you and loves you. And so telling them that that language is not okay is not okay.
I agree with you. Kim, are you out there? Did you have a question?
Sure, yes, I do. Thank you. So we've had a wealth of information shared with us this evening. And I think one of the pieces that is resonating with me is the importance of the assessment tool. Knowing what tool we are using, what is it really going to share with us, using the right tool, and then thinking about when do we use it. So my question is, based on the information shared this evening, the fact that if they're, you know, if students are well along the curriculum and that 2/3 of our children can still access, you know, the school language, the school talk, they just have to have that exposure to it, and that they may need that additional time to be able to close those gaps. How early should we be trying to test our students to determine whether or not they have a reading disability or disorder, and looking to provide intervention? How do we balance that, allowing them that exposure to the school talk time in school and the wealth of resources the school offers, with providing intervention as early as possible? And there is in the chat a comment from Ms. McIver, who is one of our speech language pathologists joining us this evening. That her comment is that there are a lot of students in dyslexia being misdiagnosed.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate, and I absolutely agree with that. I really appreciate you making that distinction, that just because a child's got a challenge accessing reading to the level that we might like them to, doesn't mean that they have dyslexia. And actually, before I moved back to Bermuda from the UK about 15 years ago, the conversation with all the researchers in the UK was doing away with the term dyslexia. They were already starting to systematically say, we don't want to use that. We want to talk about a reading disorder and being very specific in what we're referring to. So not only distinguishing between what is dyslexia and a reading disorder, but how soon do we test for it, and when should we be looking to provide early intervention while allowing for exposure within school to help close some of those gaps?
You know, I think as early as you have a concern makes sense. You know, one of the things we're trying to get away from is this waiting to fail idea, that if you are seeing kids who are struggling, there are several researchers trying to develop early screenings, like Nadine Gaab at Harvard is developing a really good screener, I think. And, you know, and trying to get past this idea that you wait, because you're really waiting for kids to fail. If you see kids struggling with reading when they're young, then intervention is in order. Something is in order that supports that child with reading, not just waiting to see whether it's going to change. You know, there's a school in Atlanta that is a school for kids with dyslexia. And they have a kindergarten that's full of kids. And so I asked the question, how did you figure out that kids in kindergarten have dyslexia? And their response was their older siblings have dyslexia and they're struggling with reading. So we're going to assume that's what it is until they show us something different. And it turns out that when you talk about things like language and reading problems, they do run in families, that there's a genetic component, and we all know there is. So if you have a family, that's one of the ways that if you have a family where there are kids who are struggling with reading or parents who struggle with reading, then that is a risk factor for the kids coming along. That if you see a child from that family struggling with reading, you should assume that they might be struggling. We do the same thing with language because it does run in families. If you are a child who has a first-degree relative, that's a mother, father, uncle, aunt, grandparents, first cousins who are struggling with reading, then if I see you struggling, I'm going to assume that we might need to step in. I do the same thing with I teach them that about language, that if you have a kid come in who's 3 and they are not developing language, how do you decide whether to wait and see or whether you should be intervening? And one of the first things you ask is anybody else struggling with language? And if that's true, you do not wait and see. You keep it moving. So there have to be some indicators like that that help teachers and school psychologists to figure out whether we need to be moving forward. But if a child is struggling with reading, it doesn't matter whether it's dyslexia or struggle with, or just, a garden variety reading problem. They need support with reading, they get support with reading. If you find that it actually is dyslexia, which has its own targeted pattern or characteristics, then you can do more targeted instruction for that. But the reality is, if a kid's struggling with reading, we don't need to wait to figure out what it is. We need to support them with reading. And in a population where a lot of kids are having trouble with reading, somebody said test hearing and eyesight. Oh my gosh, yes. The number of kids who can't see, who are having trouble at school and reading problem. I just saw that recently in a kid who has a math problem, and then he got glasses and the math problem went away.
Yeah.
Because now you can actually see the numbers. And so those are those kinds of things that are, as we're doing the, let's rule some things out. Hearing and eyesight always need to be ruled out. And then once we get past that, we need to think about what, if the child's having trouble, to support them, but know that every reading problem is not dyslexia. Someone said recently about 70% of African-American kids have dyslexia. No, they don't. About 70 or 80% of them have struggle with reading problems, but they don't all have dyslexia.
So what are some of the other reading problems? You mentioned garden variety reading problems. What are some of those? There are kids who have, they're starting to focus a lot on kids who have reading comprehension problems. Okay. So they can read the word. They're like word callers. Yeah. They don't have trouble with decoding. They don't have trouble with, just reading words, but they don't understand what they read. So there are several profiles of readers where there are kids who have trouble with reading words, like decoding, but have great language skills. Those are usually the kids with dyslexia. The other kids are the kids who are having trouble with all of it. They're having trouble decoding. They don't have great language. They are having trouble with comprehension. So there are several different profiles of what reading looks like, where reading can break down for you. We see in some other cultures, not English, but in cultures or languages like Italian or Spanish, those kids don't tend to have trouble with decoding, even when they have trouble with dyslexia, because the reading is transparent. You look at it, there's one sound for every single letter, and those are easier to read, and dyslexia looks different sometimes in those contexts. That's something we see around the world, but there are lots of different profiles of reading problems. You can have trouble with the decoding piece or not. You can have trouble with comprehension or not. And what we tend to see in our poor kids is, because they, it's one of the things we keep seeing, is that we're teaching them how to decode, but they don't understand anything they read. That is actually a problem that I hear about quite frequently here, that children are able to read the words, but they don't necessarily understand what they've read.
Right. And often those are kids who don't have good world knowledge, so they don't have good vocabulary. If you think about reading a word, I remember when my older son was learning to read, He started reading and he was doing great with the decoding. Then he came to a word and he didn't know what it meant because it wasn't in his mental dictionary. And when you get to that word, it's not in your dictionary and you search it. And no matter how you pronounce it, it's not familiar to you, then it stops for you right there and becomes a real problem for you. And so we need to make sure kids have the experiences that they need to develop a good wide diversity of words and experiences that support reading. You need all of it. It's not just about the words on the page. It's about the language that you develop to support reading. And so we do. There are very different profiles for kids.
Yeah.
But our poor kids, comprehension is a huge issue.
It's a huge issue.
Washington, I typically tell parents of my clients that it's like with me, I started learning a little bit of German and I can actually decode German. I can read it, but I'll get to a word and completely decode it and figure out I can pronounce it, but then won't know at all what the word means. So,
oh yeah, I can read Italian beautifully.
yeah.
I just don't know what it means. I can read every word, but I have no idea what they mean.
So we are at the 1 minute mark. Is there anyone out there who had a question that they wanted to ask Dr. Washington?
Stephanie Hollis says, so many other languages have dialects and it's not a problem. They are recognized by their government. There needs to be proper recognition of the language. I completely agree. And there are many places though, where there are a lot of languages and the dialects are a problem. And where they have more than one language that's recognized. Even in South Africa, there are 11 official languages. And for 11 official languages, that probably means 33 dialects. So the 11 languages are recognized by the government, but the dialects still aren't. And they become seen as poor Zulu or poor Xhosa. And that's what we're talking about here. It's not just the national languages, it's the dialects of those languages. Because if Spain has 5 national dialects, then it probably has 15 dialects that are attached to those, 3 that are attached to each one of those for 15. And so that's the piece we're not recognizing. The ones that we do recognize really help the diverse speakers, but those that we relegate to just poor English is where we see kids and families suffer.
That is absolutely the case. And I know if you go to Barcelona, you'll see street signs and everything in Catalan, which is considered a dialect. But of course, there's subversions of that, if you will, other versions of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those are the kids who are struggling, is the kids who speak the subversion of Catalan. Those are the ones who are struggling with reading probably.
Yes. So I see a question to me, which is, what do we need to do to get a certificate for the seminar? When you signed up, it asked if you wanted CE credit. We send certificates to everyone for signing up for the webinar. So it will just be sent to the email address that you sent to. So we're at 8:01. I apologize for going over by 1 minute, but please allow me to thank Dr. Washington for an absolute wonderful presentation. We appreciate your time. We know that you're on the West Coast. It's a little bit earlier there than it is here, but we appreciate your time this evening. And I am just looking forward to having you come to Bermuda so we can do some things in person. We'd be happy to have you come here.
I would love to do that. I mean, I've been talking to my university about language for people of African descent across the diaspora and not just here. That understanding it all will result in some answers that are not so specific, nationalistic to this country, but that will be applicable across dialects. And there's some that are, but that's not the way we're studying it.
So we look forward to having you expand your work and come on here. We'll provide you with some great samples and great information.
That would be great. I'm coming with Margie and Chip.
Okay.
I want
I want to
invitation, Julie.
So thanks to Margie and to Kim for co-hosting and assisting with the questions. And thanks to all of you for participating. Keep an eye out for our next in the series, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. Bye. And presenters, please stay on for a minute after everybody has
Sure.
left.
Said that just in time.
Had lots of people thanking you, Julie.
Oh, and saying how wonderful it was. Fantastic.
We kept everybody on the, that's a good sign when no one drops off, right?
Yeah. And you answered so many of the questions that I had sent that were actually questions that I had gotten from audience members. So, yeah.
People are still coming to the waiting room.
Maybe they
really?
had their time off. Apparently, that's funny.
That's not me.
What was that, Paul? No. Well, actually, yes, you can go ahead and record it. But we'll have to take it out when we send it out to YouTube. Is that possible? Or can you stop recording and start it again in a minute? How about that? Okay, so stop recording. Good. I think
We might have to stop it rather than pause it and start a new record.
yeah, that's what they're doing. Thanks, Kim.
Okay.
So I think it's pretty much just us. So I just wanted to, again, add my thanks. I hope all these people got in. There were like 7 people in the waiting room.
I recognize.
I think they were probably hanging in and they may have been exited.
Oh, okay. Okay. Julie, again, thank you. This was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
You know, as someone was mentioning in the chat box, we recently, as of March 17th, were notified that some Bermudian isms, Bermudian English words, have been added to the Oxford Dictionary.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really kind of exciting.
That is, that's cool.
Yeah. But those are actually really words that we use in a different way. Like Gumbe, or, you talk about somebody being your ace boy or your ace girl. We have a special word that we use called mice, and it's not referring to mice either, the mice that you use to control your computer screen, or the mice that run around that nobody wants. If somebody isn't paying attention or they're daydreaming or whatever, we would say that they're micing. So.
I never would have gotten there from mice.
No, you would not. No, you would not. You're micing. You're not paying attention. So, so anyway, I have to mention that. So we have had some of that happen, but I think you just touched on so much. And I just wanted to take a minute to debrief with everyone. I don't know if you had any other comments or anything that you thought we should pick up on.
No, I appreciated your questions, Margie, because it's hard to talk about the impact of dialect on reading and move people away from a deficit perspective at the same time. It's a dance, because despite the fact that it influences reading and writing in that way, it is valuable for kids to maintain it and to learn where to use it and what you need to be doing differently at school. That's not the way we've approached it as a country, that we're always trying to eliminate it, and that's just not appropriate, Well,
it's funny.
Spanish and Chinese.
Yeah.
When I was promoting this event, I was on a talk show, and some of the people giving feedback were saying people just need to learn how to speak properly.
Yep, that happens.
And they were some were a little insulted at the idea that, some of them speak dialect, or that those words should be viewed as acceptable language.
Yep. Well, you know, the most pushback I get when I do is from middle to upper middle class Black people.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
the ones who give you the pushback
Yeah.
because they have come to see it as something that is low class and something that's not acceptable. And I know even I grew up in a family where we weren't allowed to speak it.
Mhm.
And my mother said when I started doing this work, the more education you get, the worse you talk. And
Oh my gosh, Julie. Oh,
she grew up in the South in a community where, you know, the whole focus really was on getting out and assimilating and doing things in a way that would make you, she thought, more successful, and that this was a barrier. Well, any language is a barrier if you don't learn the language of the place you're going.
Yeah, that's true.
At the place, the language from the place you came from has to go away. It's just that you have to learn the language of school. If you go into an English classroom and you only speak Spanish, you better learn English,
Yeah.
or you're not going to succeed in that classroom. And that's not the way we have approached it, because I think oftentimes in our own community, we see it as low prestige. And
Yeah.
so, but the consequences that it has for the kids who continue to speak it is devastating.
Mhm.
You know, I kept seeing that in Atlanta at the university level. It's devastating for them that people don't value the way that they talk and think that judge their intelligence by the way they speak.
Yeah. I think down here, a lot of people do code switch. And I know in my family that, you know, it would be one thing if you were kind of with a certain group of people, and then it's another thing if you're not. But I think it's really important for people to kind of value
Yeah.
that language.
Well, you know, the switching actually is more common and seems to be done with more ease in the Caribbean.
Mm. Mhm.
Jamaica, the same is true in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's particularly true on the islands who were once British colonies.
Well,
They-
we're still a British colony, sort of. I mean, we're part of the Commonwealth. We're an
Yeah.
overseas territory. Sorry.
And those seem to be the places where people really get the difference between home and school language.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I think it's taught. It might not always be taught kindly,
Right.
but it's taught.
well, that's why your message is so important, Julie, and I so appreciate it, because I think both parents and teachers need to understand that. And I think we've become more sensitive, hopefully. In the last year, I feel like, you know, people are much more mindful of these things, and we need to talk about them. We need to
Well,
accept.
that's the thing that's changed. People are more open to talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Kim, did you have any comments? Or?
No, I'm quite happy listening. I thought I was very excited for this evening's presentation, and I was not disappointed.
thank you.
Forward to when you're able to join Margie and Chip, and maybe at some point getting to actually meet in person.
I would love that. I'd love to meet the kids and teachers and everybody in person.
Well,
And
that
all
would be
So-
wonderful.
There was, I actually wrote down all of my people's names. So about half of my reading teachers from all the primary schools were on the talk tonight.
Good.
So I was very excited by that. Most of them are primary schools, but one of my middle school reading support people, as well as one from one of the senior schools. So we had that spread, plus a couple of officers, actually a few of the officers, one for foreign languages. So I was getting the messages by WhatsApp too, saying, oh yeah, that's a good point. Oh, that was great. And I was like, oh, I'm glad you were able to join. As well as the assistant director and the student services learning support officer for early childhood education. So for us, that's up to 8 years old, from preschool through grade 2. So it was fantastic to see kind of the collegial support that was there. Some of the class teachers, I recognized several class teachers' names just from lists, not necessarily even by face. So I think we definitely managed to hit some of like a wider range than I was necessarily anticipating. So I'm excited about that. I think that provides us, another avenue for opportunity for us to develop things even further in as we continue our series, and hopefully for another talk by Dr. Julie Washington.
Yeah,
Anytime.
yeah, absolutely.
You're
Anytime.
very,
So, yeah, go ahead, Margie.
no, I was just saying you're wonderful, so generous, Julie, and most appreciated.
Thank you. My pleasure, Margie. Absolutely.
And my
Yes.
sidekick has been.
Hey, how you
Hi,
doing?
Chip.
Hey, Jen.
Thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm going to challenge Dr. Tweed and Dr. Gillis here, and Kim as well, about the research they're going to be going into I guess August, September. They ought to figure out how to incorporate some of your work in it, and you join the research team and work remote, and then also come to Bermuda. So
I would love that. I like the idea, I really do, of thinking about dialects. There's so much overlap in many dialects, and figuring out how to leverage what we know to reach a larger number of kids, I think is really important. Because when I talk to my friends who work in like Israel and Cyprus and places like India, they're all dealing with the same issues. We all are.
yeah,
Yep.
that's right. Yeah.
I think that would be really important. And I also found your perspective of assessment to be very intriguing, because we have some things that we're looking at to improve assessment, which I think are invaluable. But you also raised some issues about, in our previous conversation, about the validity of some of the assessment protocols and outcomes that you're seeing.
Yeah.
And, just looking at some of the issues that we have here in terms of the overdiagnosis of dyslexia, what is happening with reading generally in our schools, I think some of what you're doing with assessment would be really pertinent to what we're trying to look at here.
Well, if there was any way to include Bermudian students, I would really like to do that. It would improve the validity and reliability of the instrument across dialects.
Okay.
Fantastic.
I think that's absolutely something that that I can assist with.
Okay, I would love to do that. It's important. And our assessments, we use them for everything, and they just aren't telling us what we think they're telling us. We've been talking a lot about this issue with reading tests. I think I brought this up with you all, where we see students get tested in the early grades and then they look great, and in the upper grades they don't. And a lot of that is about the rate of growth. They're just not growing fast enough. And they might have known it when they were younger, but we expect a little more as they get older. And our kids who are have more resources are growing faster. And these kids, and if they're dialect speakers, we really see the rate of growth of reading slow down at the end of second grade. That's something I didn't say, but by the end of second grade, we start to see slow down in growth. So one of the things I'm interested in is whether there is a critical period for learning to use the language of school before it starts to hurt you.
Wow.
That you're not.
Well, there
Because-
were certainly parallels, it seemed, between what you're finding and what we're finding here. So it would be really interesting to know if the reasons are the same.
Yes.
And we're really interested in figuring out what we can do to stop the slump, or the slide, as you termed it,
Yeah.
and to make sure that children can learn how to read
Yeah.
and become good readers.
Yes. And the thing is, if there's a critical period, it means we need to ramp it up
Yeah.
in preschool through second grade in order to get kids reading
Mhm.
by third, fourth, and fifth grade, and not continue to see that slide.
Yeah.
And it means that that we need to be focused, I think so anyway, focused on growth and not remediation.
Right.
Everybody focused on remediation. It's like, no, we need to focus on accelerating growth,
Yep.
not remediating.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the question is, how do we do that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that we have,
For us.
Margie?
I
What was
said
that?
we have our work cut out for us.
We do. We
But that's
have
good. We
a
don't
second
mind that.
component
Yep.
to our assessment protocol.
If we figure out how to do it, Margie, we got the keys to the kingdom.
You got that right, Julie. We're gonna keep trying,
Oh, great
keep
stuff.
trying.
Great stuff.
Well,
I-
thanks,
Go
y'all.
ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you so much.
Well, thank you. This has been a real joy and so informative and so helpful. And I think it's the start of a beautiful relationship.
Yep,
Music to my ears.
That's
Yes.
great.
yeah.
So again, thank you so much. We won't keep you any longer. Margie and Kim, I think we have a meeting coming up
We do,
next week.
this week.
Yeah. So we'll be able to pick up from there.
Yep.
So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
You too.
Thanks, Julie.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Margie
Bye,
and Chip.
Kim. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.